How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I found this piece of terrain at my local hobby store, and I thought it would make a great centerpiece for a diorama. The idea that I had was to take the classic Black Hawk Down scenario and apply it to the Star Wars universe. If you're not familiar with Black Hawk Down, or this scenario that I'm describing, basically imagine a routine situation that should have been no problem, that all goes south after some unexpected event occurs. Now, the scenario is a survive till your allies can come and extract you while you fight off wave after wave of attacker. If you ever played Ewok Hunt in Battlefront 2, you'll know what I'm talking about. Honestly, it could make for a fun Star Wars movie. A close-up character-focused story in the style of a classic war movie told from the perspective of a squad of stormtroopers. I don't know. Could be cool. Let me know if you think it's cool or cringe in the comments. And I know for sure I'm not the only person who's ever thought of that. I got the ATST together in very little time and it looked great, but there were a couple things that needed to change. I wanted to have some fire that was visible through some openings in the ATST, so I'll be opening up the eyes, which came closed, as well as the impact on the side. And to do that, I will use my Dremel gracefully. I switched over to an X-Acto knife to be more precise when cutting out the eyes. And I know they're not eyes, but you knew exactly what I was talking about when I said eyes. So we'll call them eyes. I used a file to make sure those cuts stayed nice and clean, and the last change that was needed in the plastic was a hole in the base to allow the wires to pass through later. Again, I used my Dremel to do that gracefully. With the path made for the lights, it was now time to work on the base, which I made from XPS foam. I broke out my hot wire table to make some nice clean cuts. The goal here was to end up with 2 sheets of foam that were the exact same size. Now that I had 2 sheets of foam that were the exact same size, I needed to cut the crust off of one of them. You'll see why I did that in a second. After all the major cuts in the foam had been made, it was time to put the hot wire table away and glue the foam together using some foam-safe super glue. And as you can see here, now I have a nice big cavity under the base for all the electronics to fit into, and then the offcut will go on top and make up the rest of the terrain. Initially, my plan with the terrain was to have this whole thing be one big hill with the wreckage of the walker in the middle. I realized it was already on a hill of its own, and it would look better surrounded by little clusters of elevation instead. When I was happy with the layout that I came up with, I proceeded to glue everything down, using more foam-safe super glue, of course, and then I broke out my Dremel once again, and this time with a vacuum and a respirator. After engraving the initial texture, I went back and evened things out with a wire brush and a few light passes with a butane torch. Like I said, I was wearing a respirator the whole time. I had a window open with some nice airflow. When that was done, I made sure to remove all the remaining foam dust and then began blending the texture of the plastic hill into the area around it using boulders made of offcuts made of XPS foam. When I was satisfied with the way it looked, I cleaned up everything else. The next step was to add some terrain texture to the base. The rocks on the plastic base are slightly sunk in, so that's what I will be attempting to do with the foam boulders that I just made. I mixed up a couple batches of Sculptamold and delicately applied it around the rocks, trying to blend them into the ground around where they sat. Additionally, some of the texture that I had made with the Dremel did not look that natural, so I filled in those places as well. After that, I mixed up some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge to create the terrain paste that will cover the remainder of the base. I'm often asked why I add paint to the terrain mix if I'm just going to cover everything up with paint later, and the answer is twofold. 1, it helps me see where I've put it, and 2, the latex in the paint does add to the strength, flexibility, and paintability of the terrain paste as well. Before the terrain paste had dried, I sprinkled on some sand to get some texture in those low areas, and I spritzed it with isopropyl alcohol, and I glued it all down with watered down white glue. I set the base aside to dry for the night, and it was time to paint some minis. And the minis in question are a bit of a forbidden mix. I had a few leftover Rebel fleet members, the ones with the egg helmets. I had some Snow Rebels from Hoth, and I'm combining them with some old school classic Rebels, which were a gift from a patron. And thank you to everyone who let me know how to open Ziploc bags. Your advice was very helpful. I don't think it's too big of a deal that I'm combining Rebels from different settings. They are kind of a ragtag group after all, those Rebels. And this is a made-up scenario. So as long as they're all painted similarly, you won't be able to tell from a distance. After priming all the minis black, I broke out the airbrush and gave them all a zenithal highlight. To paint the minis more speedily, I'll be base coating them all with contrast paints. And while I paint these, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. It goes against the purposes of stealth and good battle tactics to wear bright clothing that has almost no camouflage capability, but I wanted these rebels to be visible from a few feet away, which is how most people will be viewing this diorama. Also, the rebels are supposed to have a decent bit of saturation and vibrancy compared to the monotone, sterile look of stormtroopers. And it also would have been a bummer to finish painting all these nice and stealthy and then have it look like a bunch of blaster bolts were flying from nowhere. That would have been the alternative. After all the contrast base coats were on and fully dried, I switched over to a wet palette for the rest of the paint job. I had fun building up the highlights on these traditional rebels. Then I switched over to the cold weather and egghead rebels to give them some needed highlights as well. After all the rebels had a coat of paint, it was time to move back to the base, which by this point had dried overnight and been given a coat of matte black from a rattle can. I followed the coat of matte black with a zenithal highlight sprayed over the whole thing using the airbrush, which I concentrated on the high points as well as the low points. I got a little carried away with the highlight, but from there I threw a coat of sandy tan over the whole base, and then I tinted the ATST with some green and blue washes to help it stand out from the rest of the surrounding terrain. After that, I loaded some warm earthy colors back into the airbrush and moved back to the dirt to wrap up those base coats, which I followed with a drizzle of burnt oil umber wash. Burnt umber oil wash. When it comes to painting terrain, rocks in particular, this oil wash step, even if you're going to cover it up later, makes a huge difference, in my opinion, for the overall realism. After the oil wash was dry, I built up the highlights on a few of the individual rocks with more concentrated application from the airbrush, finally followed by a final highlight on both the ATST and the rocks using the wet palette again. Because of my weekly upload schedule, in the past I probably would have just dry brushed the highlights on this thing and called it good. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I've been trying to speed up my ability to paint highlights with a brush, so large terrain pieces like this are the perfect practice ground. With my freshly painted base, the next step was to throw on the minis. Now, obviously, I have a battlefield full of rebels, but it's no battle if there are no Imperials. I found this at my local hobby store, and while I was there were absolutely no stormtroopers to be found. Luckily, I know of a place where I can find some. It's a little sad to steal minis from my original core set, but honestly I plan to get the updated core set eventually and repaint my whole army when I do. So it's also kind of fun to be able to give these guys a second life. And speaking of my local hobby store, when I was there recently, I ran into my friend Brian of the Smuggler's Room, who some of you may already know of. We share the same local hobby store, which is pretty fun. If you haven't seen his channel, you should definitely check it out. He's working on a cool project right now called The Pit. But if you like Star Wars and crafting things, you should definitely check him out. The next step was to get the electronics figured out. I glued my battery housing in place under the base, and then I melted a hole for a toggle switch. After that, I wired up some flickering cob lights, which will create the flickering effect that will be seen from inside the cockpit of the walker. After getting those glued inside the cockpit, I ran the wires down through the base, and then I grabbed some filaments because it was time to start working on the blaster bolts. These are 3-volt red LED filaments. They can be found at multiple places online. I ordered mine from AliExpress. I traced out the path of the blaster bolts, then I jammed some metal rods through the foam base wherever they needed to be, then soldered the filaments to the top of each pair. When the filaments had all been soldered in place, I tipped the diorama up on its side and I tested the polarity of each filament, marking the positive and negative rod, which made it a lot easier to wire this all up in parallel, which I did off camera. Once everything had been wired up to the battery housing and to the switch, the last thing to do was to paint the sides with black 3.0. And once those sides were nice and clean, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.